Hello, thank you. Sorry about yesterday. All right, and so I see the familiar names, which is great. So let's see here. Put your names down. I know I'm going to have to really rush in grading the rest of your stuff. I still will read it, I promise. Um, but yeah, it's just a long story that there's no excuse for. So this is a unique assignment, right? If you've looked at the prompt, in that it entails watching a video, and I'm going to share the screen here, okay? All right. So it says here, please choose one video question to address. If you have the chance, for the sake of the final, please watch all the videos, should you have the time. Your first option, right? It's the Red Scare and Stalin Terror, the Cold War. All right, and I have the URL there. Explain from the data in the video what President Truman meant in saying that the U.S. would not turn into a right-wing totalitarian government in order to combat a left-wing totalitarian threat. And that's a very common, I almost wouldn't call it revisionist history, because that was very, obviously that it wasn't written in the 50s, because that was in the midst of this type of homogenous, uber conservative era. But certainly by the 60s, people, with all the protests and so forth, this historiography, this type of interpreting it, was prevalent. And that is right, is that we were becoming the very monster that we were afraid of, right? We were aping the Soviet Union's ways. Okay. So as I mentioned in the previous lecture, we spoke about, remember the argumentative section that suggested, I had two of them that were kind of antithetical to each other. The first one was Court History, A Great Man History of Harry Truman, and suggested that he was just the deterrent that Stalin needed and the Soviet Union needed, to keep them literally afraid of being continually aggressive, right, and destructive toward all the free-thinking, freedom-loving people of the world. Then we do a 180 in that last assignment, with the Cold War, just prior to the Civil Rights assignment, which I hope you enjoyed. We covered the possibility that maybe Truman and his somewhat Manichaean, no gray area. There's just black and white. There's good versus evil. It's almost always deterrence is the weapon or tool that we use, right, to try to keep the Soviet Union afraid. And that perhaps in some ways he could have exacerbated tension, the possibility of brinkmanship, right, where you diplomatically begin to draw lines in the sand, right, to the point of extortion, to which you're going to have it your way diplomatically or else, and you could threaten war itself. And then later on, the expression by the Nixon administration was mutually assured destruction, right? That do we really want to do that? Because we're sure to destroy everyone in the process of some type of atomic war, right? As you know, the Soviet Union in the 50s, by the 50s, early 50s, gained access to the use of splitting the atom for military purposes. So at any rate, right, when you look at number one, you're going to see that along the lines of the historiography of the second one, in that previous assignment, whereby you're going to see an ugly side to the U.S. You're going to see a very intolerant atmosphere. You're going to see an infringement upon the First and Fourth Amendment rights of a lot of American citizens, right? The right of freedom of expression, as well as freedom of to be secure in their persons from unwarranted searches and seizures, etc. And yeah, so the video is going to demonstrate that pretty well. I don't know how much in depth I need to get, because if you choose to do that one, you'll learn it in the video. But notice a couple things, right? Is you had the McCarthy, right? Joseph McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin. He held up a piece of paper that said he had over 100 names of American people working for the State Department, for the federal government, who were spies for the Soviet Union. And by the way, no one, first of all, some people contend there was never a list. Others contend not a single person on such list was ever indicted in a court of law, and nothing was proven against anyone. But boy, it started a witch hunt. All right, they went after Hollywood. You'll see that in the video. They eventually climbed their way up to the armed forces and again the State Department itself. All right. So you'll see that, and you'll see how it's going to be portrayed as being very hypocritical, very excessive, very oppressive, and just not in line with Western civilization's notions of, like, classical liberalism, with, you do your thing, I do my thing, as long as you don't step on my toes and I don't step on yours, all is well. The natural rights, individual rights of all people from the Enlightenment and Scottish Enlightenment as well. So all those things were kind of thrown under for the sake of national security, for a sense of xenophobic rivalry with the Soviet Union, and almost hysteria, as far as the fear of a fifth column. And the fifth column is a demographic within the United States that is ready to subvert American institutions and harm America as a nation itself, with the help of outside enemies. And so don't get me wrong, you had some verifiable cases. If you look at the Rosenberg case, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, we went over this. You look over the Chevalier case, similarly connected to the Manhattan Project with the atomic weaponry, and supposedly sharing secrets with the Soviet Union concerning how to construct it. And then you also had the case with Alger Hiss. Whittaker Chambers came out and contended that he had been a spy for so many years and that he wanted to come clean. And he eventually, he and kind of prosecuting American patriots, if you will, and patriots might be considered in quotation marks, like a young Richard Nixon, just wouldn't let up on this until Alger Hiss served time in prison. So you have these things going on at this time. Like I said, a lot of this will be clear when you look at the video. But notice, right, that it was as if, due process was certainly subverted, for one thing, right, as part of this hypocritical imitation of the Soviet Union's ways. You were considered guilty until proven innocent in many of these cases. If you were part of initially, of course, the American Communist or Socialist parties, oh my goodness, you could imagine, the IWW and other radical organizations that wanted literally the eventual overthrow, some violently, some via ways that involved, elections and slow political evolution, an overthrow of the American capitalist system, and perhaps even the Republican form of government, as well as the economic system. And so clearly they were attacked. Okay. But also it got to a point where if you even joined a labor union, you know, the AFL, the CIO, these were considered, you know, just kind of all American blue collar uh, you know, institutions that finally, under the Wagner Act during Roosevelt's administration, received recognition. And now, even joining those unions, and they were put under scrutiny and persecution, etc., because now even being a part of a labor union was considered excessively leftist and Soviet-like. All right. Uh, with the intelligentsia, it could get to the ridiculous level. Uh, you know, depictions of Robin Hood. Okay, you're trying to steal from the rich and give to the poor. You're trying to reallocate natural resources and wealth. That is there's a communist undertone to that. And so it was crazy, the extent to which it fell in the 1950s in particular. And it's kind of ironic, right, that this is seen as kind of the happy days, because, you know, the economy was booming. You had the baby boom. So materially, people were doing better. Also, you had a lot of censorship over music and in cinema, whereby there was an attempt to try to adhere to kind of Victorian Judeo-Christian norms. But yeah, and then of course you also have the irony of the Desperate Housewives. Those are just a few ironies of the 1950s. And the youth culture, the beatniks and so forth, who railed against all this demand for conformity, right? So that you're supposed to have 2.5 kids, a spouse, and a white picket fence, and live in suburbia, and wear your suit and tie to work, and not read the improper novels, not watch the improper movies, not listen to the improper music, etc. So there were blacklists, etc., where the government would go after people and they would tell people, like in Hollywood, if you hire these people, who, by the way, had never been indicted, or they had been indicted, many of them, they had never been convicted, that if you hire such people, there will be punitive measures taken toward you. So it ruined some people's careers, at the very least. All right, so you look at that, and that's your option of number one. It's a very interesting but kind of dark revisionist. Although, you know, revisionist, I say that because most of the time the initial accounts are court history, right? Praising the winners, etc. And then it creates a reaction, a pendulum swing to revisionist historiography. But in this case, it really wasn't that way. You know, the 1920s were denigrated almost immediately, and the this whole second Red Scare was denigrated almost immediately in history books as well. Okay, but not for sure at that precise time. It was expected. It was the norm. It was even considered virtuous. So then number two, the Cuban Missile Crisis at the Brink by PBS. So please balance a defense of the Soviet Union's leaders with criticism of the Soviet government regarding the precarious military showdown. Wait, please balance the defense of the Soviet Union's leaders with criticism. That should be of the US government. Doggone it. All right, so I'm going to change that. Maybe I'll put it out in an announcement. My apologies. That wouldn't make sense. There's no sense of balance or juxtaposition with both Soviet. So yeah, defense of the Soviet Union's leaders with criticism of the US government regarding the precarious military nuclear showdown in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's not very deep intellectually, historiographically. I apologize. What you're basically doing is playing the blame game here. All right, on number two, should you choose it. But of course, this video and this topic are very interesting. All right, and so as you may know, in October of 1962, there was a very palpable threat of us engaging in nuclear warfare with the Soviet Union, because we had found evidence of them setting up the apparatus. I don't know what the plural is for that word, to hold intercontinental ballistic nuclear tipped missiles. And they were facing from Cuba 90 miles to Florida into the US. So this was an existential threat that the president and the press and the country felt, right? You have stories of loved ones who went to school at that time in the 60s, and they would undergo regular drills whereby they'd either evacuate buildings or they would hide under desks, because a desk is going to protect you from a hydrogen bomb. I'm being silly. But at any rate, there was a great sense of angst, right, at this time, that the world could end as we knew it, because of this nuclear threat that we were facing from the Soviet Union. But prior to that, we armed and supported and trained I believe it was about 1,800 Cuban immigrants from the Bautista regime, not necessarily members of the Bautista regime, but who did well under the Bautista regime, and therefore were anti-Castro when he overthrew Bautista in 1959. And so now they're coming to reclaim their country. But 1,800 coming to take the entire island? They were hoping that the people en masse would join them in overthrowing this dictator, not Fulgencio Bautista, Fidel Castro. So at the last minute, President Kennedy, he inherited this, as you'll see, through the Eisenhower administration and their plans. He pulled American support out at the last minute because he made a public promise on television that he would not be a part of any military endeavor to invade and topple Castro's Cuba. So the air power was rendered, out of bounds, so to speak, and they were humiliated. Not only were they humiliated, but evidence quickly arose that we were behind it, despite our last minute decision not to physically participate in it. There's a famous story of a fighter pilot who flew back to Florida, contended, right, that he had he was using a Cuban jet fighter, and someone literally, as he was speaking to the press, scratched off the paint and the facade of the nose and side of the plane, and it demonstrated clearly that it was an American fighter jet that had been lent to him. So it became a joke. It was humiliating, but it also made us look, like a giant trying to prey upon a tiny little island. And yes, you recall the domino theory. You recall the Truman Doctrine, right? But this was beginning to give us a different taste of communism when you see, arguably, evidence of a curious mixture of fear, but also of adulation, of praise amongst the Cuban people for Fidel Castro. Because after all, our CIA and others knew that communism might sound very appealing to poor developing countries. The idea of allocating evenly all land and resources, doing away with class differences, etc. So at any rate, not sure if the Truman Doctrine technically would apply to that then, technically. according to its rationale. Because remember, we were to protect an unarmed majority to whom opposition arose from an armed minority, numerical minority, trying to impose by force or the threat thereof communism kind of down their throats. That's very arguably doubtful that this was the case in Cuba. Just check out the video yourself. All right. Then in addition to that, for years, we had Operation Mongoose, where our CIA was trying to assassinate Fidel Castro. And we also secretly had nuclear weapons in Turkey. So see how that goes down. See step by step how and when and through whom and by whom things may have escalated as far as tension and the possibility of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. I recall just from this Central Valley of California, just a presently shut down Air Force base not far from here, whereby there was a gentleman who had literally left the said Air Force base and was in air with a nuclear bomb. Now, I doubt he had the fuel to make it to the Soviet Union. I don't remember the details exactly what he was exactly up to, if he was maybe heading to Cuba. But that was in our local newspaper. I kid you not. So then in addition to that, so that's your second option. And you're basically just playing the blame game there. And you should note what's kind of hinted in the question is that I'm trying to suggest that it's not one-sided, that it's not at least completely one-sided as far as culpability, all right, and responsibility for that scare. Then a third option is found in the American Experience documentary on Vietnam. This one's a little different. This one, to be honest, is pretty highly revisionist. All right. It's very skeptical of the US. It is much more than many documentaries I've watched, Vietnam focused from their perspective than it is from ours. Okay. So as I have here, it gives much information from a Vietnamese perspective. Consequently, please write a page arguing how this video suggests that this war was ill-advised, immoral, or inconsistent with American ideals. And I have the warning there, okay? Some graphic images in this one. So I have here a list, and I believe I put this on the previous announcement. And that is that you do not have to consider, A through G here, a to-do list, to go through, to scrutinize, to look up and study, to incorporate into your written, response. This was just the product of my scattered brain thinking about if I were to write this paper, if I were to do this assignment, what might come to me as far as relevant questions, relevant issues or facets to the topic, context. All right. But a lot of this, if not all of it, you're going to see in the video. Should you choose to do this one, or if you have the time to watch it, even if you don't do your assignment on it. And so, right away, I don't think I need to even tell you, it's not going to be news to you, reminding you that, under Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, long before him in the 1800s, classical liberalism and its influence over American political tradition, supposedly. The Atlantic Charter during World War II. So many of these sources, right, of our political tradition take it as an axiom, right, as an assumption that you don't even question, that it's an axiom that mankind ought to be free to devise their own governments, to elect their own leaders, to be autonomous as a people. Woodrow Wilson put it generically, that term people, because then you get into, the details, the messy details of, okay, is it ethnicity or is it mere nationality? Is it somehow a blend of both, etc.? So at any rate, that's you can get down a rabbit trail on that one. But in this one, at the very least, national sovereignty, autonomy to decide your own destiny. So that's a bit ironic, right? Our involvement therein. But also there was something different as well that ought to be considered, that I think is very relevant context, even if you're not too harsh against the US, is option F. All right. Technically, in the Korean War, according to the UN, all right, and if you follow the notions of just war doctrine from the Catholic Church, international law from early modern era till now, you believe that the international community of nations, organized especially, that they have a sense of authority, and they ought to have a sense of authority in dictating some rules of conduct for national conflicts and so forth. And one of those entails the assumption that the international community can get together at the end of a war, especially, and decide upon national boundaries, okay, that are intended to be permanent or not. Well, in the case of Korea, from what I've read, they were to be permanent. There was to be indefinitely separate North and South Korea. So technically, right, internationally, legally, the North Korean army invaded a separate sovereign country when they crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. That's not the case here, as you'll see in the video. The UN decided at a specific date there would be general elections above and below the 17th parallel that separated North and South Vietnam. And those elections would entail a new unified Vietnamese government. And guess what? We have information to substantiate that our government not only obstinately supported the South Vietnamese president in refusing to have such elections, but supported that decision based upon gathered intelligence that led us to believe that the South Korean candidates would lose. I'm sorry, the South Vietnamese candidates would lose. So we didn't want to, we defied a UN order, refused to have the election because our guy was not likely to win. Now you're toppling on the other side of the good guy regarding international law, regarding just war theory, etc. So I thought that was interesting, learning that for the first time. And but recall, right, is that that conservative Eisenhower era, or perhaps even Truman before him, assumption, right, is that with that type of paradigm or outlook toward the Soviet Union, that deterrence is the word. Deterrence is the pivotal method of keeping the peace. That under that rubric, you can't look weak. It's like the stereotypically looking weak in prison or something, right? Where there's a sense of distrust of others around you, and that they'll take weakness as an invitation to prey upon you. So there was that component to it that I think was very, very relevant to this topic. I believe I've read and heard on documentaries some quotes from President Lyndon B. Johnson, who was responsible with his Congress in putting the majority of American servicemen into Vietnam to fight, whereby he acted as if that could never be an option of just stepping out of South Vietnam and letting the North Vietnamese army, the North Vietnamese leader, Ho Chi Minh, simply take it over and expand communist territory anywhere on the globe. It would make us look weak, and there would be horrible repercussions from that. All right. And then by most accounts, I have to admit, I've never read a book just on this topic. It's always included in the books I've read on Vietnam, but it's always the same, just general coverage without enough detail, I think. Is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It seems to be almost universally interpreted that it was fabricated, or at the very least, it was greatly exaggerated, claiming that we were in international waters to begin with was very, very suspect. And then it could have been perhaps a few shots fired toward the general vicinity of American troops. You'll see in the video, this sticks with that common interpretation. So it makes it look as if, in hindsight, that the president, Johnson, was doing everything he could to fabricate, right? To literally make up a justification, an excuse, to legally ask and morally ask Congress to give him a blank check, if you will. Because that's what they somewhat did in Vietnam. As you may know, it wasn't technically a declared war. All right. You'll see in there also, when we sensed that No Dinh Diem was backfiring on us and keeping support for capitalist economy, Republican government, we had him removed, which involved an assassination of him and his family. So our government had him killed. Kennedy gave the okay, ironically, months before he himself was killed in Dallas. But you'll see there in the video why he was a bad fit in South Vietnam, and why it definitely could be argued that he was not the mouthpiece, nor even a proper representative steward of power for the population that he was over. All right. You may have seen a horribly iconic image of a Buddhist monk lighting himself on fire in the middle of a street. That was against No Dinh Diem and his persecution of the Buddhist monks. He was not a popular guy in his own territory. And you're going to see a very appealing, humble, not too antagonistic to American Western traditional political, thinking, with obvious exceptions because he was communist, in Ho Chi Minh. Right? So does anyone have any questions or comments? I thought the last one was a little bit deeper, the discourse that I chose. Again, it's not that deep. It's mainly still kind of a blame game type narrative. But at least you're considering American political traditions, what we claim to stand for, etc. I took that approach rather than the somewhat alluring, but I feel less intellectually rigorous topic of how we lost as far as battle tactics and leadership, uh, dissent at home, etc. But that it should be included fairly well, generally, in this video. And then note at the end the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were given to the press by a man named Daniel Ellsberg. He was a whistleblower, and he gave out sensitive information about what the U.S. President and military were up to toward the end of this war. And it's rather indicting against the U.S. I want to leave some of it up for the video for you to watch. But fighting when we were not supposed to be fighting, and fighting where we were not supposed to be fighting, using weaponry that we denied using, etc. They became known as the Pentagon Papers. And then it went to the level of ridiculous. The Nixon administration's attempt to try to suppress the dissemination of this information, their personal attacks upon Daniel Ellsberg, it goes into the realm of bizarre. And remember, this is the same president who the same thing, you think, I remember learning in high school. Okay, so he wiretapped the Democratic Party's, main domestic embassy at the Watergate Hotel. All right, I'm sure both parties have done much worse than that. But it was the whole cover-up of Watergate that went to the realm of illegality and, like I said, just ridiculousness. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? I hope you find one that you really enjoy, that you find interesting, because that galvanizes the brain to work more effectively and diligently. So by all means, maybe watch a few minutes of each of them and see which one grabs your attention and your interest. All right, so can I get a thumbs up from anyone that you guys feel perhaps a little bit, thank you, Kirsten, a little bit relatively better, having listened to me blab? Okay. So again, I want to apologize this semester. I genuinely enjoy meeting on Zoom. I do. I love speaking about these topics. I love it when anybody asks me a question or has a comment, knows additional information to chime in with. I love all that. But almost for those reasons, you combine that with a tendency that I inherited from my mother to get tunnel vision with what is immediately in front of me. I've given an inordinate percentage of my time to my in-class students for reasons you could easily infer. They come and ask me questions. They make demands of me about their grades. etc., at the end of class, almost on a regular basis. And so I'm just running for them. And then I'm like, oh man, my online class, I gotta go. And and so I just I want to apologize for being so derelict in grading your papers. I'm gonna have to go real far back to get through them in the time that I need to do it. And that would have given you much more feedback regarding my expectations, regarding my quirky style and what I, am looking for. But I promise you that I'll keep that in mind when I grade your stuff. That when I think, she's missing this and this very, very essential adjunct to the thesis. So I'm thinking usually I'll give like a 44 out of 50. I'll be like, you know what though? I've only corrected a few of their assignments so far. So I'm going higher than that. So I promise you, I'll keep that in mind when I grade your papers. All right. So are there any other questions or comments before we say adieu? For the penultimate time. We'll meet one more time regarding the final. And this is it. Any comments or questions?
No,
Right. Yes.
I just meant no, as in no questions or
Oh, okay,
comments.
sure.
Sorry.
No, thank you, Marisol. Okay, you guys, and I'm gonna go ahead and let you go for the second to last time. And I wish you well on this assignment, okay?
Have a nice evening.
You as well. Thank you for always showing up. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for everything. We greatly appreciate you.
Thank you, Kirsten. That means a lot to me. It really does. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Have a nice day.
You as well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.